Welcome to ERGT Radio. I'm Mike, your host. Thanks for joining us. Well, one of the guys I work with asked what my view was on global warming this past week. And I realized that it's not something I've discussed on my news articles or here on the radio program. So I figured to discuss that in this episode. Global warming. It wasn't always called global warming. Back in the 70s, Time magazine came out with an issue discussing the new ice age and if you were prepared for it. Well, it's been almost 30, 40 years since the 70s, and there's no ice age. So obviously that wasn't true. All my adult life I've been hearing about the global warming. Do you believe in global warming? To be honest, no. That's a quick answer. No, I don't believe in global warming. Global warming has been pretty much an instrument of fear that powerful individuals have used on the American citizens, and other governments throughout the world have used to scare their populations into doing stuff that makes absolutely no fiscal sense. So now they call it global warming, and there's big articles. Al Gore was a big proponent of global warming, and that was his big campaign thing. Well, obviously the world hasn't burnt up yet, and they've kind of pushed it further and further out in the future. Well, maybe the climate of the earth will change gradually over time. It may take 100 years, and then they just keep pushing it back, a couple hundred years, and until they realize, oh wait, we're actually in a cooling cycle. So they came up with another name for it, for the future of the global warming enthusiasts. They called it climate change. Well, if you say the climate is changing, the climate's changing all the time. It goes up, it goes down, that's the climate. So to say you don't believe in climate change would make you look rather unintelligent. So they put a new spin on this and called it climate change. And the Earth goes through natural cycles of heating and cooling. That's how things are. Big push 20, 30 years ago was, whole global warming. They're just going to burn up, the ice caps are going to all melt, the water level's going to rise, and all this destruction and mayhem's going to happen. You watch anything in the last 10 years of a science movie of the world ending, somewhere along the line they're going to either bring up man-made pollution, global warming, something along those lines. The newest NASA picture of the North Pole's ice cap shows it has actually grown in the last 20 years, which would prove the global warming thing wrong. So they call it climate change. What is the motive for this climate change? Well, it's pretty much fear. And if you get somebody scared enough, worried about their future, which most people are worried about where they came from and where they're going, because they know where they're at now. So if you can get people worked up and scared, they'll do things that defy all common sense. And one of these things is green energy. You got to lower your carbon emissions and go all these green energy companies. Which, if you actually do a lot of research on the, quote, green energy companies, most of them are failed companies, or they receive government subsidies. Now, why is that? Well, the bottom line when it comes to energy and money is most people tend to go for the cheapest type of energy. The energy that's going to be easier to maintain, costs less to use, maybe not necessarily, quote, better for the environment, but it's what is there. The available energy. If you're in a very windy area, windmills would make a little more sense than putting them out in the middle of nowhere where there's no wind at all. On the other hand, you got solar panels. Well, you're not going to want to put them in the North Pole for the simple fact that 6 months out of the year, you're probably not going to get practically any power. So, most of these companies don't succeed very well because the average American looks at it as something that's not going to be cost effective for them to use, So why should they waste the money when they could be spending on other things? And to be honest, I can't say I blame them. And we have all these, government has pushed this, energy thing onto the American people. The environment. We've got to save the environment. I'm not against protecting nature. Don't take your nasty chemicals and just dump them out on the ground. That is being irresponsible. However, we have gone far beyond any common sense when it comes to this protection thing. The EPA is a powerful organization and has pretty much bullied its way onto payrolls of government officials. Somebody in the government, let's say, doesn't like how you do things. And let's say you're going to expound on a new project, a new building. Well, the EPA can go in there and come up with some analysis that says, well, there's a spotted raccoon that migrates there every 4 years, and you'll be destroying its habitat, so you can't build anything there. Is it true? It might have a little bit of truth of you putting something there, but nature adapts and has adapted and will continue to adapt to the surroundings that are there. Now, on the flip side, I'm not saying run through the woods and kill all the bears either. There are responsible ways to do things. But we have given so much power to the EPA that it is ridiculous. They can pretty much push their agenda of energy restrictions onto the United States as a whole. And for the most part, I don't believe that the EPA is very pro-American. And I'll explain that. One thing that they're really difficult about, if you want to use the word, is that of oil drilling. Now, you will hear politicians throughout the world use this carbon emission nonsense. We got to cut down on our carbon emissions, the greenhouse gases. Well, here's something I have to say to that. If every politician that wants us to cut down on our carbon emissions, or carbon dioxide emissions, which they call a greenhouse gas, if they would keep their mouth shut for approximately 5 minutes, aka holding their breath, throughout the entire world, I guarantee you throughout their lifetimes that they would have had, they would cut down on millions of pounds of carbon dioxide emissions. And the greenhouse gases would be lessened. It would also solve another, quote, problem that they say we have in the world is overpopulation. It would cut down on some of that too. Are they going to do it? No, they're not going to. Because it's all a bunch of baloney. One volcano exploding will send more carbon ash into the atmosphere than every major city will do in a decade. One major volcano will do this in a matter of minutes when it erupts. And you will see the results throughout the world. The moon will change colors. The ash cloud thousands and thousands of miles away. So all of this really isn't true. Going to the topic I was going to hit on was the oil drilling, the EPA. Well, they want to keep us from drilling our own oil in the United States. Whether you believe that or not, there's a lot of things you can see that would give those of us that are more for energy independence, make us think that way. Every new oil drilling project, they'll come up with some reason why, whatever habitat it's in, whether it's in the middle of Texas, in the Gulf of Mexico, up in Alaska, they'll come up with some reason why we shouldn't do the drilling. And most of it isn't really based on a lot of fact. It's just that they do not want us to have energy independence. Now, another thing that has been pushed out of existence is coal. Coal has been very abundant in the United States. Back in the Industrial Revolution, coal was used for almost everything. Well, they have pushed this idea that coal is completely bad. And there are different types of coal, which not a lot of people know this. One coal that, when you burn, is really ashy and doesn't produce a lot of positive energy. Well, most of that coal is not used for energy production. Why? Because it's inefficient. But we have concocted this idea that coal is bad. The carbon dioxide is bad, which we all breathe that every day. So the EPA has pushed that out. Another thing that infinitely abundant that they've been pushing a ban on is lead. They used to use lead for everything. Now lead, when it's ingested, is toxic. I understand that. But lead is also an easy material to put in a lot of items. I'm not saying to put lead in, toys that you give to your kids that they end up chewing on. I'm not saying that. But using lead for a lot of applications made things cheaper. And since we have pushed away from that, things have gotten more expensive. Lead-based paint. People pushed the whole idea that lead paint was bad. I've lived in a house that had lead paint. Don't eat the paint chips. Got it. If you're eating non-lead based paint, you've got another problem. So don't eat the paint. That's kind of logical. But it made paint really easy to manufacture and it was cheaper. And right now, because lead has pretty much been banned as a whole in our society, you can't use it for practically anything. They've even made lead illegal in the state of California for hunting purposes. And they've pushed out the lead manufacturers for bullets. Does this really make that much sense? We have pushed away from this energy independence idea. And why is that? As I said, I don't think the EPA is that American, that pro-America. What made us great? The innovation, the new ideas that we used to push out, the great innovations that we've had. Henry Ford and the automobile. I didn't see the Japanese coming up with that one. The great farm equipment that we developed in this country. And that didn't come from India. So all these great innovations that we've had, we've put a damper on by restricting our energy capabilities. And one of the things that does happen, you get these guys that have these great ideas for alternative energy. A guy would come up with an idea to have a car run on water. It would split up the hydrogen and the oxygen, and then hydrogen's a good burning fuel, oxygen's a good burning fuel. But then all of a sudden you get all the naysayers, oh no, we're going to burn the world out of water and we won't have water for anything. And who wants to stop every so many miles to put water in the tank? Well, you might not realize it, but that's what the same thing they said about gasoline. Who's going to have gas stations every few miles just to keep filling up the tank? Well, that's what happened. They're out there. I can go within 2 miles of my house and there's a gas station. Unless you live out in the middle of nowhere, that's probably true for you too. There's other innovations. Some of them, are nice, cool ideas like the solar-powered car. They sound cool, but you can only drive it in the daytime for the most part. They've got battery-driven cars. Several of the major manufacturers have come up with a battery-powered vehicle. It's supplemented by gasoline, but has some battery capabilities, and some of them are pure battery driven. Granted, you got to recharge them after driving for so long, but the problem with those is that we have restricted our energy capability so badly that in order for somebody to construct one of these alternative sources of transportation of energy and have a real world application for it, it is so expensive. And look at it, when you want to buy the battery powered car, or you could buy the cheap $15,000 car. Which are you going to buy when you have $15,000? Well, you're going to buy the cheaper car. Yeah, you got to fill it up more, but you're going to go with what is cheaper. And yeah, the battery car may save you money on all that gas, but you still got to pay for the electricity to charge it. So a lot of people, they don't turn to the alternative sources of energy because of that. And there are a lot of different ways we can do this, but because we have hampered that energy usage, we can't capitalize on these great inventions. I have my own theory about that. Some of it has to do with money. Okay? You may or may not agree with me on this, but there is some logic involved. Now, you have the huge oil companies, ExxonMobil, BP, all these huge oil companies. And you got all the oil in the Middle East who have a strong monopoly on our oil, which I don't agree with. If we have the oil here, why aren't we using our own? Because if we could use our own, we wouldn't have to deal so much over thousands of miles away in the Middle East. Yeah, they won't be making as much money, but we would. So why can't we make more money? We've got these big companies. Well, they have all the monopoly on our energy with fuel, oil. They pretty much control everything from aviation, automobile power, ship power. All that is controlled by a handful of companies. Now, if you have all this money coming in on a normal basis, would you want some tiny company starting up that had a very successful idea of an alternative source of energy? Would you want them to be successful? Because in the long run, it's going to cause you to lose money, because if they become successful, their product becomes cheaper. People are going to want to buy their product. They're not going to want to buy the expensive oil that's well over $100 a barrel, which analysts said would never happen. And they're not going to want to buy that expensive oil because there's an alternative out there that's cheaper. What you would see a lot of is these great ideas would get bought up. The rights were purchased, so the oil company would just sit on it. So that innovation, which could have been used by everybody, is now gone. Or, let's say the person didn't want to play ball. Well, there's been more than a few odd disappearances in the last 20 years that people can't really explain. So from a business standpoint, that is something else that is hurting our economy. And most of these companies, they're not all U.S. based. BP, British Petroleum, they're not in it for our best interest. They're in it for the money. And we as American people need to push for that energy independence. That freedom that we used to have to be able to drill our own oil, use our own resources, the coal, the lead. There are proponents of the EPA that I do support. Punishing the people that, take their hazardous waste and just dump them on the ground. That is not good for the environment. Period. Those chemicals aren't found naturally in the environment. Don't dump them naturally in the environment, because then you start destroying your other resources. But the same token, the EPA has gotten way out of hand. Like most government organizations, it had a great premise, a great start, to conserve things. But slowly through time, like any government organization that has had time, money, and no checks and balances, what do you think is going to happen? You can buy money, power, no checks and balances, and a lot of time. Those four things are a very bad combination to have. Some of you have teenagers that are listening in on this program, or have had teenagers at one point. Would you give your teenage boy or girl a lot of time, money, no supervision, and authority or power? I would be scared to death. Most of you guys know I have kids. Well, when my oldest turns 16, I wouldn't want to trust any of my kids with any of that. No offense, but I wouldn't trust anybody with a lot of time, money, power, and no supervision. And that's what we've done with the EPA. We've put this idea in a box, and for years it's just sat there and wrote its own rules, and it's manipulated its way into government officials' back pockets, and the money is just thrown out there. And because of that, it can restrict and do whatever it wants for wherever the money comes from. Now, from a logical standpoint, that doesn't make a lot of sense. And you expect that not to affect things the way they are now? There is a way we could do it. Have some serious government oversight. And when I mean government oversight, I mean such as the people we put into office. Because those people answer to us, the American people, or they should answer to us. One of the things that has happened recently is, you get this representative or senator in Congress, and they sit there for 2, 3, 4 decades and wonder why they're as corrupt as sin. Well, because you gave them time, money, power, and you're not holding them to task in the ballot box. You're not making them feel the pressure of making dumb decisions. But if we put the EPA and other conservation government groups back in line answering, not just doing a hearing like has gone on with Obamacare, but doing an actual, you answer to us. We don't like the answers, you're gone. Things would change. A lot of the outrageous laws and procedures that are forced on companies that are trying to produce energy or produce a good but that have outrageous EPA requirements, those will go away. And in return, all that money that is spent on all the regulations that they have to follow, doing all these specific requirements to protect from greenhouse gas emissions, do not release hazardous chemicals in the environment. If you release some of the idiotic policies that are binding a lot of these major companies throughout the United States, what's going to happen? Well, all that money is going to go somewhere. They're going to be able to put it back into the product, which means here in the United States we're going to have better products. Not only will they be better, once again, but they will be cheaper, once again. We won't be subsidizing jobs overseas, which that's one of the other things that was big in the last election. Obama accused Romney of sending jobs overseas. Romney denied it, keep American jobs, whatever. Whether you believe him or not is irrelevant. From a business standpoint, would you want to pay the American regulations, the prices, the minimum wage you have to pay your workers, which in some areas is $9, $10 an hour? Or would you ship them overseas where you don't have the heavy environmental restrictions, the heavy taxes that is done on your company, and you don't have to pay your workers $10 an hour? You can pay them $5 an hour and they're still richer than anyone else in their country. What would you do? Well, from a logic standpoint, you're going to want to make money. So to make the money easier, you're going to send the jobs overseas. Now, just from a logic standpoint, I would. Now, I have nothing against American workers, American employees, employers. In fact, if it were up to me, I'd prefer to have the jobs in America. But we have handicapped ourselves with our outrageous energy policy, all stemming from this great climate change, that is no longer efficient to work, own a business, because you've got all these regulations, and there are books and books and books and books of laws just to do this, just to do that, just to start your company, just to follow the environmental regulations that you have to. Books and books on the tax code that it takes a lawyer to fully understand all the laws and legalities of everything you can and can't do. The employment regulations you've got to follow. All this. We don't make it easy on ourselves. We make things a lot harder than it should be. And with the whole energy issue, that is one of them. I mean, you used to be able to go to the store and buy an incandescent light bulb. How easy is it to buy an incandescent light bulb now? They push this mercury-laden fluorescent spiral funky light bulb on us, claiming it was better for the environment. But if you break a mercury light bulb and are exposed to mercury, mercury is a toxic liquid metal. And for the EPA regulations, it's supposed to be cleaned up by a hazmat team. Yet we're supposed to buy these and put these in our homes? We're all upset about having lead in the paint, but we put toxic-filled light bulbs in the light sockets. I've seen a broken mercury light bulb because it's filled with mercury, and I know what's in it. Mercury is toxic. Some of the regulations that goes on don't make any sense. And what we need to do is get back to our energy independence. So what would be my idea? Scaling back the EPA, running them back in under the government, sifting through pages and pages and pages of laws that are now on the books, and stuff that really doesn't have a purpose, get rid of. With all the trash you would get out of it, you could probably run a paper mill for a few years. Just on the paperwork alone that's probably stuffed in their offices. So why don't we go back to that? Something that's controlled by the people. Well, it's back to that fear thing. Fear is power. Fear is control. If you can control people, one of the best ways to do that is fear. You can tell them exactly what to do, when to do it, how to do it, what they're allowed to buy, and they will have to go along with it. Then, when you don't give them a choice, they'll just keep on doing it just because that's how they had to do it for so long. Does this sound familiar to any of the old-timers that went through the Cold War, of how the Soviet Union did things? Some of us haven't been alive through most of the Cold War, so we don't understand how bad they had it over there in the Soviet Union. Maybe if we actually taught that, things would begin to change. The freedom that we have, that we should have, would grow. I've told this to several people, and the greatest threat to freedom is a man seeking power. which is true. When the man gains his absolute power, nobody has any freedom. Second part of my quote is, a man seeking freedom is the greatest threat to tyranny. So a man who has that absolute power, he doesn't want anybody seeking freedom, such as those here on ERTT Radio. Why? Because it's a threat to his power. The greatest threat to freedom is a man seeking power. The greatest threat to tyranny is a man seeking freedom. And that's all we have time for us here, folks. Thank you for joining us here on the program. Hopefully you got some good insight on global warming, the fallacies of climate change, along with energy independence that we should have here in America and the freedoms that we have lost because of it. If you have any ideas that you want me to talk about on the radio, just hit me up at my email at miked@erttradio.com. And as always, live free and die free.